It does seem like some kind of a prerequisite that if you write the kind of stuff I write, you have got to do some kind of Lovecraft story. So I've spruced myself up a little bit for this, and this is a short story I wrote, oh heavens, I don't know, way back in the 90s as kind of an homage to H.P. Lovecraft. And I'm going to write it a little bit, or should I say I'm going to read it a little dramatically because it's kind of written in that epistolary fashion, but not quite the way he used to write because, well, you know, had to modernize it a bit. Anyway, this is Ovum. I screamed, knocking the covers off as I bolted to a sitting position. A sweat stain remained as if my soul had been left behind on the sheets. Still uncertain my whereabouts, I flicked on the table lamp, upsetting a glass of water and my clock in the process. I sighed in relief as my familiar flat came into view, but terrible images refused to leave my mind. I had dreamt of the city again. The city I'd dreamt of for almost a month. Always the same. Always terrifying. I'd found myself in the middle of alien streets, staring up at black monoliths, rising 15 feet in the air. The buildings seemed to have grown from the ground, their organic shapes jutting from the earth at every imaginable angle, as if a plant had mutated early on in its growing process. The sickness in my stomach told me the towers, if indeed they were towers, hadn't leaned with time, or bent with the tremor of an earthquake. I knew, as unnatural as it appeared, that for this city it was quite natural. The streets were smooth as a sheet of slate, and the edges melded into the walls as if the entire city were one solid structure. The buildings bore no windows, at least none I could take for windows. Only indentions and strange glyphs adorned the architecture. The strange monoliths bore similar glyphs, spiraling up around the stone in one straight line like an ascending vine. Whatever inhabitants the city possessed must have deserted thousands of years before. But the ancient stone still throbbed as if some irregular, unearthly heartbeat laid somewhere in its center. Even in its dormant state, the pulse filled me with such foreboding I shrieked into the vastness of dead air. At that point I awoke as always, my own scream bursting through into the waking world. I rubbed a hand down my body, the sweat so thick I could have just stepped from the bath. Silence choked the breath from me, and I staggered to the shower for the sound of rushing water, as much as the cleansing of stench from my body. I'd had odd dreams before. Poets always dreamt of madness, but this exceeded any which had ever plagued me before. To add to my unease, I felt a certain familiarity to the city. Something deep inside remembered it, though I know that cannot be. I couldn't write a line of verse anymore because all that came out were ghastly descriptions of the evil place. I even wrote things I didn't remember dreaming, lines which rambled on and on about things so strange I could not discern their meaning. Soon after, I destroyed the poems. No one would have bought them, and no one should have been subjected to their content anyway. My shower finished. I dressed and ate breakfast, hoping the familiar motions of life might wrench my thoughts away from dark stone and cryptic glyphs. Nothing worked. I tried to read books, listen to music, recite verse I'd memorized. No avail. In desperation, I threw open the curtains in hopes the sun might wash away my shadows. My heart shuddered, and I nearly vomited. Outside my flat, there in the heart of my own beloved city, stood a great shadow. The city of my dreams. It jutted from between the buildings, a horrid island in a sea of brick and glass. It stood black against the horizon, sucking light into itself. I closed my eyes and opened them again in hopes of waking, but the hideous thing remained. I stood gaping. My heart quickened to the point of bursting. I could endure it no longer. I would rid myself of the damned thing once and for all. I would face it like the night terrors of my childhood. In minutes I was down the elevator and on the streets. To my chagrin, the monstrosity remained, standing 20 blocks or so away. I asked a passerby when the city had appeared, and he looked at me as if I were mad. "Don't you see it?" I pleaded. The passerby walked faster. No one seemed to notice. Had I lost my mind? Perhaps the dreams had driven me over the edge, pushed me to a state of wakeless sleep, and I was now standing in yet another dream. I hesitated, feeling the inherent dread of the place. My good sense fought the curiosity, but a sound came into my head. It was like a siren call, tugging at my chest, pulling on my very being with such force I fell forward a little and had to steady myself. I trotted at first, then ran. Stopping across the street, I watched people jog within feet of the shadowy edge. Mothers with their baby carriages trotted by without a glance. It couldn't be. They had to see it. With my heart still thundering beneath my ribs, I neared the border and stopped. A black stone towered above me, beckoning with its vile siren song. Taking a deep breath, I clenched my fists and crossed the threshold. It was as if I'd stepped into a dizzy spell. All the insane angles made a certain maddening sense, even as my head fought for equilibrium. It took falling to the stone ground, coated in layers of dust, eons old, to regain my balance. But it was then that a whiff of that dust invaded my nose, and with it came smells which brought back memories. As a child, I must have dreamt of the city, walked its streets, taken in its odors. In sudden fear, I turned back to see my city beyond the black boundary, terrified it might be gone. It wasn't gone. Though a wavering haze like heat rising from hot asphalt obstructed my vision. All instincts screamed to run through the haze, dash back into my city and escape this sable metropolis. But I knew I could not. Just as I had in my recent dreams, and those presumably from my childhood, I turned again and plodded on. The awful pressure inside my chest, which masks itself as curiosity, dragged me forwards. There were terrible secrets I'd locked away, dark spots of the space in my mind where I must have blotted out these dreams and repressed all memory of them. As I walked, a wind descended upon the streets, and I was forced to take shelter against dust the torrent sucked into the air. I found myself in a mangled archway and watched as the sky darkened like a gray cloud, becoming clear an instant later. It was then that the very stone of the city began to change. The gray slate texture cleared, or should I say, blackened. Like an old man returning to his childhood, the city became smooth and shiny as if made of some element, with such a shine it put obsidian and onyx to shame. The 20-foot monolith stretched taller, not like a fingernail growing from the earth, adding to its base and pushing up, but like an amputated stump growing a new appendage. They continued rising all over the city, rising beyond the highest towers, extending thousands of feet and disappearing from my field of vision into the sky, a feat most impossible by modern architectural advances. I could only imagine they might be reaching all the way into the clouds, but being only 4 feet wide and 1.5 feet deep, they simply vanished from view beyond a certain point. The air changed as well. I choked on the freshness, the atmosphere so ancient no modern pollutant had ever touched it. I knew to my fear and wonder I now stood somewhere in the city's ancient past. knew my world lay no more beyond its boundary, and I dared not look behind me, back down the street from whence I'd come. I could not face my city gone, replaced by the alien surroundings of Earth's distant past. Then it was I wept. Somehow through the siren's song tugging me there, the curiosity that murdered the proverbial feline, the unspeakable pulse beating at the very yearning of all poets wishing to touch the muse's face, I felt the truth of my predicament. I stood in that place, ancient even to the very dawn of man, and I knew I could live 1,000,000 years and never know the gates of Eden. I had little time to lament the state my artist's visions had brought me to, as a surprise far more nefarious than the unaging of the city unveiled itself before me. Soft wraiths slipped from the walls, entered the streets, and moved about me. In a matter of time which could not have exceeded half a minute, the specters became quite solid. They moved about the streets and the towers and the outcroppings of the walls. I must say they moved because they did not walk, but neither did they slither or glide. To describe their movements as the slow, undulating crawl of a slug would not be wholly inaccurate either, but at the same time would not quite describe it. Just as difficult would be to describe their appearance, which from certain angles seemed to be that of aquatic life, but with skin not unlike that of the scales of a serpent, and wings that lay flat, crisscrossed like a bat. They all looked very different from each other, though the general shape I've described applied to most of them. The taller, larger ones had heads resembling an octopus or squid, though the colors were not consistent, nor the features of the face, or what I took to be a face. They also wore what I took to be robes, though the material appeared more like skin. Their skin, or the skin of a long extinct reptile, I could not tell which. I did not shriek at their appearance, and can only account for this by saying I must have been far too frightened. I could not move or feel my own heartbeat. They paid no attention to me, perhaps because they did not see, or because I possessed no threat, or interest of any kind for that matter. I assumed the latter, as one or two of them did seem to glance my direction, though I will never know for certain. And what I took for eyes bore into me for moments, but then passed me by. To them I must have been an insect, or perhaps a ghost from the future. They towered over me, at least 40 or 50 feet tall, and I doubted they would have noticed running into me, or over me, as the case would have been. I realized I could hear them thinking. Like one monstrous mind with 1,000 different facets, I discerned their alien murmurs. I believe I'd heard something like it before in my mind. I probably had all my life, but never knew the source of the gibbering strangeness in the back of my head. It was not like words, but more concepts fluttering against the edge of my consciousness, images and reasonings. Relay, I muttered and did not know why. That word triggered memories which stopped me in the middle of the street. I stood, frozen and shaking. I remembered the names I could never pronounce except in my own head. I remembered these terrible things I dreamt of as a child, but repressed, and knew this part of the dream in my adulthood must have come just before I awoke. My mind must always have awoken before this moment from the long dormant warnings. These were the beings I once thought slithered in the closet and beneath my own bed. These were the creatures I drew in class which terrified the schoolmasters, and I was forbidden from ever drawing them again. There was more I'd forgotten, but my mind still held those mysteries, and I cannot deny my relief in not accessing them as well. I continued slowly, avoiding the monstrous things as they passed. I was looking for some place they might not be, some sanctuary where I might hide. No, that was an excuse to myself. I was really searching for more. An eldritch section of my psyche longed for the rest of what hid behind the door of my mind, behind the locks and bolts I'd fashioned in my own subconscious. To my astonishment, glancing about, I found other visitors joining me. A young girl shuffled down an intersecting street. She ignored me, and I guess I ignored her as well. She moved as if in a trance, and I knew I must be toddling in much the same way. Her pale skin, stringy hair, and paint-splotched dress told me she must have been an artist of some discipline. We were probably all artists of some sort or the other, the only ones sensitive to the siren voices of these long dead beings. Dead? Well, I hoped they were dead. Perhaps they weren't, and the thought crawled beneath my neck and bit the base of my brain. I saw an old friend and fellow poet walking towards me. We made eye contact and passed each other without a word. We were all slaves of a sort, compelled here by our dreams, and I could only assume the city must have appeared simultaneously all about the globe. Indeed, I saw an elderly man with gray turban and no shoes walking an outcropping of an obtuse angled tower. We were all searching for something beyond our conscious knowledge. I looked above me and noticed an altar, or perhaps dais. It stood at the heart of the city where I now found myself, though I now feared the look of the great threshold which stood behind the platform. It was a double door, designed somewhat like those of a great cathedral, but grotesquely shaped from obsidian-like stone. As I watched, the black doors trembled with the heartbeat of the city. Great machines or some unseen force pulled them apart, but did so without noise and in all but imperceptible slowness. Their opening unveiled an interior so dark it sucked the darkness from around it, much like the city itself had to my beloved city, making the black doors themselves almost bright by comparison. Sweat poured down my sides. I wanted to cry. I'd seen those doors open before, but could not remember what had stepped through from the darkened lee of my perception. I was not long in awaiting my deepest fears, for in moments a form passed through the doors from the dense interior. It was even larger and more grotesque than the others. The creature bore the tendril-laden head and scaly, slug-like skin of the others, but something about its countenance put their own darkness to shame. It walked on something not unlike human legs, though the claws and color and shape were most inhuman. Nor were they of any other species I'd encountered. As it neared the altar dais, its great wings expanded and the voices quieted, though I muttered beneath my breath the name Cthulhu. He made no sound, nor thundered any thoughts. It, simply motioned to the nearest monolith, as if stating all in that one great gesture. The creatures reached out to the monoliths with appendages which lay hidden beneath their fleshy robes. My stomach churned as the action brought me more dark memories, and I found myself walking towards the nearest black stone, creeping its way into the sky like some primordial beanstalk. An entire side had not been taken by one of the other creatures, and with the deepest fear and apprehension I lay my right palm flat against the smooth surface. The writing which spiraled up the black stone burned a little. An inward knowledge from my dreams said it worked like a wire running up into the heavens. My mind spiraled as the burning pulsed, and I saw the vastness of space in my mind. Well beyond the ether, I gazed upon the orbits of planets in my own solar system. I realized the stone itself with aid from the spiraling writing, worked as a sort of mental spy scope, peering deep into the stars. The field of view lay beyond any mortal imagining. I saw the solar system in its entirety from a great distance. Something seemed even more off than one might expect, but I could not say exactly what. As I watched, for I had little choice, we closed in on a small planet, no bigger than my own, in orbit between Mars and Jupiter. It was this 10th little planet I realized seemed so far off to me before. I marveled at how much it resembled my own world. I knew my schooling could not have been that much in error, and I counted again to be sure. 10. It was 10. How far back in our history could we be? As I neared, I saw the surface to be largely blue, with vast expanses of land dotting its surface. Nearer still, the land proved populated with cities and towns, though our collective sight headed for a patch of dense jungle. There, between the masses of green foliage, stood a spot of dead land, dry, black, and barren. And in its center stood another black city, a sister to the one I now stood in. From that distance I saw the city throb as if breathing. I then perceived, though not with sight per se, a tentacle, or nerve perhaps, an organic tube of some sort extending from the heart of the city down into the planet. I should not have experienced such a feeling of dread at such a thing, but some unknown truth filled me with a trepidation unlike any I had felt to that point. I knew somehow the city was to be sacrificed and its inhabitants honored. If indeed honored could even be the right word. I had this knowledge in the way one always does in dreams, though this was no dream. I knew with my dreamer's mind's eye that black idols stood at pivotal points in the sea and on land. I knew they were somehow connected by the inhabitants of this world, slaves coerced by the siren song of dreaming. They bowed low, chanting words I could not repeat if I'd had the kind of tongue to pronounce them. The idols throbbed to the beat of the city, and all minds watching with me cried out as the very land began to quake. First on one continent, then on the other. The surface perforated from end to end around the globe as our vision pulled back enough to see the whole thing. The planet swelled, and chunks the size of nations flaked off into space. It was at that moment my heart stopped, and my mind for a moment slipped into complete madness as the entire surface burst, sending the entire planet in all directions as bits of rock debris. In place of the planet, a mass of globulous pulp heaved. The mucus-like membrane tore, and from it unfolded, much like a butterfly from some eldritch sick cocoon or baby chick from its egg, a monster of indescribable proportions. Its shape resembled the rudimentary shape of Cthulhu, but unlike that terrible beast in every conceivable way. It stretched like a waking creature, the bits of membrane and mucus-like substance tearing further as the demon arms and claws reached for empty space. It glanced about as if getting its bearings, then flew from our solar system and disappeared into the reaches of deep space beyond. As these beings had done for eons, this chosen one had reached its final potential, and left to destroy planets and galaxies to feed its hunger. What planet they had originated from, I could not say, but they must have traveled from some distant star to lay their offspring here. How long ago must that have been? Millions, billions of years? In a sudden flash of inner light, the final wall of my mind broke. I knew my place in their ultimate design. I knew all their assignments, us dreamers of hideous dreams. I saw myself standing at the idol, chanting unpronounceable names, calling to those ancient creatures from the dregs of time, to this monster they named Cthulhu. Desperately I fought to return to my body, willed my hand to pull away from the great monolith. With all the strength which lay within me, my palm wrenched itself from the black stone. I saw through my own eyes again, and with sudden vertigo I fell back against the obsidian street. The resident creatures and those poor souls of my unborn race still stood attached to the monoliths. Cthulhu stood for a moment, staring out over the city before stretching its arms to the sky, and called more unpronounceable words to the blackening heavens. My mind heard deep inside the abstract concept, the words, "I descend." This I took to mean several things at once, and therefore was not surprised when the platform on which he stood began lowering into the city, and I can only suppose deep into the ground and to its very center. I did not wait for further prodding. Fearing the creatures would soon awake from their monolith vision, I sprinted down the streets in abject terror. More importantly, I ran from the destiny imposed upon me. Indeed, I dashed in a mad frenzy, tripping over small obstructions in the road and careening past the monoliths with as far awake as I was capable. The threshold lay in sight, though I knew not what lay beyond it. But be it my world or death on the ancient version of my world, I cared very little. At the boundary's edge, I saw the city I ran towards lay on the very edge of water. I smelled the salt. I knew it must be a vast ocean, as I said before, the way one knows only in dreams. By the same token, in my mind's eye, I saw the black city drifting further out and sinking deep beneath the waves to wait eons for re-emergence. Drowning seemed a fitting end, so with what I can only describe as dying courage, I leapt from the edge towards the waves. I landed hard, not expecting an asphalt street to be my destination. Standing up, I glanced behind in crazed panic and observed the city had vanished. My city once again replaced the canker sore of black Byzantine architecture had made of it, with buildings lovelier to my eyes than mere bricks should ever be. For a moment I felt free, the city but a memory and the hideous creatures a figment of dream. Then the siren song came again. I closed my mind to it, knowing the maddening sound called me to some dark idol somewhere. The song came louder, but I fought back with all my will and ran for the safety of my flat. Once inside, I bolted the door and locked myself in the bathroom. With fingers shoved deep into my ears, I babbled nonsensical phrases to myself until the calling finally stopped. The world seemed suddenly quiet, more quiet than I'd ever heard it. I returned to the streets, fearing the worst from such a simple victory. The others must have answered it. They must have done their terrible deed, and my help was no longer required. I sweated, wringing my hands in terror, and I walked the streets as if I might find some sanctuary from my fears. But the silence confirmed the prophecy of dreams. It had not ended. There had been a final note, not yet played, and I knew it as I knew my own name. With the sinking sensation which only comes at the climax of a nightmare, I stared into the sky for the last time and heard the ground crack beneath my feet like an egg. And remember, guys, if you enjoyed this story, please hit like down below and subscribe to my channel and hit that little bell icon so that you'll know when I come up with another story, because I have a lot to read to you and I can't wait. Also, check out my book, Storm Dreams, on Amazon. You can also find the link below in the description. I hope to see you guys soon.